Welcome everyone to our August 3rd Thursday, The Family Saga, writing the multi-generational novel. My name is Sam Babiak. I'm the program director for the Writers League, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. But before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists for the evening. First up, we've got Justin Deabler. Justin Deabler grew up in Houston. He dropped out of high school when he was 15, went to Simon's Rock College, and graduated from Harvard Law School. He's the general counsel for the Queens Public Library. He lives in Brooklyn with his husband, son, and 2 cats. Lone Stars is his first novel. Welcome, Justin. Next up, we've got Rubén Degollado. Rubén Degollado's work has appeared or is forthcoming in Lit Hub, The Common, Texas Highways, and the recent anthologies Living Beyond Borders and La Familias. His first novel, Throw, received the Texas Institute of Letters 2020 Best Young Adult Book Award. The Family Izquierdo, his debut literary novel, was a Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2022, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, Texas Institute of Letters Fiction finalist, and a PEN/Faulkner nominee. He lives in and writes about the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Welcome, Rubén. And finally, Kimberly Garza. Kimberly Garza is the author of the novel The Last Carrancuas. Her stories and essays have appeared in Texas Highways, Electric Literature, Lit Hub, Copper Nickel, and elsewhere. She holds degrees from the University of Texas at Austin and the University of North Texas, where she earned a PhD in 2019. A native Texan born in Galveston, raised in Uvalde, she is an associate professor of creative writing and literature at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Welcome, Kimberly. All right, so we are going to spend the next hour or so really diving into the craft of the family saga, the multi-generational novel. But I want to start this conversation by asking each of you to tell us about your multi-generational novels, to give the audience some context about where you're coming from as we set out in this discussion. So Kimberly, I will start with you.
Oh, of course, I have to start. Great. Thanks, Sam. Thank you all for being here. To kick things off, I'll throw a little wrench in the chat just to say that there are multiple generational families in my book, not all from the same family. My novel is really about kind of the families that we make, but also about this particular community in Galveston. A lot of them neighbors, a lot of them interweaving in each other's lives, either in facets like seen and unseen, but lots of different generations. At its core, there is one family unit, a very small one, which is the main character of Carly Castillo, who is a 20-something young woman who's been born and raised on the island, and she has been raised by her grandmother, her paternal grandmother, Magdalena, who is also a native of the island and is of the belief that she and Carly are descendants of the Karankawa people, who they believe are no longer present, which is not true. They're very much present. And then there's a number of other people who kind of crop up in the book, including Carly's mother and her father, both of whom left her when she was a child, and then sort of their neighbors and family and their friend family. So yeah, it's an interesting way to kind of talk about families, I think, but I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Rubén.
So my novel, The Family Izquierdo, is about the Izquierdo family from McAllen, Texas, here in the Rio Grande Valley. And what binds the family is a generational curse put on them, or not, by a jealous neighbor. And when I think about because this panel has really got me thinking about multi-generational novel. For me, as a Mexican-American author, and just from my background, if I was going to tell a family story, I couldn't write it any other way other than multi-generational, because every level, from the grandparents to the children to the grandchildren, they all have a part of the story. And in my book, there's different effects of this curse, whether perceived or real. And I just wanted to show how throughout the generations, even though there is a curse, there's also the ties that bind and the love that brings them together.
Thank you, Rubén. Justin.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks to the Writers League for putting this all together. It's really good. I was saying earlier, I was so psyched to meet these other two authors because I love their books, and it felt like a really terrific opportunity tonight. My book, Lone Stars, it opens with a new father comforting a baby in the night and wondering to himself, what do I tell this kid about where I came from, particularly if there are a lot of people who would have given the answers that are gone. And so I think that this multi-generational novel that I wrote was sort of, a searching question of like, how do you construct and reconstruct family history when there are gaps that like nobody's there to help you fill, but sort of paralleled questions I was having myself as a new parent. And then across those generations, I think the book explores different kinds of American outsiders and different forms of migration, people not being able to form lives where they were born for various reasons, whether it's, crossing a national boundary in your undocumented status, or being a veteran, or being a sort of woman. I mean, maybe up to the present, arguably, but certainly in the 60s and 70s, when the mother character in the book, a young queer identified kid, and sort of exploring across generations, what are the resonances that different outsiders experience, and what do we learn when we try to recreate the family unit for a new generation?
Yeah, thank you. I love so much of what you're saying. And I think, the fact that the book that you were writing was kind of reflecting these questions that you yourself were kind of grappling with. I think a lot of writers can kind of identify with that process. And so this next question, I'll stick with you for now, Justin, but I want all three of you to answer it. And just like, what were you able to explore in these generations across these family sagas? Like, what were the themes that came up, and what kinds of questions did this family saga offer you as a storyteller to sort of grapple with? And Justin, I'll stick with you.
I think, as I was saying before, fueled on a personal level by this, everything is more exciting in life behind a closed door. So if there's something that you can't get answered, it's certainly motivating. And I think on a formal level, I totally understand what Rubén meant about like a family story needing to be multi-generational, because I became very interested as I was asking questions in my own writing about psychological patterns that get repeated, and different kinds of relational reenactments that happen across generations of a family, things that get passed down. Some of them, and this is another thing that I think is interesting about some of the intergenerational novels that I like, is how they reflect larger sort of social forces that are happening across the different times when a family is alive. Because for me, some of the patterns that I was exploring originated with stigma. They originated with things that had to do with a lack of opportunity, in people's lives. And so that's certainly something that gets passed down and with which I'm familiar. So.
Thank you. Rubén.
I'll kind of take a different tack, is that when I think about a multi-generational novel, the way just from my perspective, like, I think of it as a party. We're all getting together. So my family, and people say there's not 10 children. That's not realistic, because I have a family tree at the beginning of my book, and there's 10 uncles and aunts, right? And I'm like, okay, I actually have 13. So I pared it down because they couldn't all fit on the page, right? And that's on one side. And then I have 7 uncles and aunts on the other. And anytime we all get together, I have over 50 cousins, literally like over 50. And the children of the cousins, I have to look at their little faces. And I say, okay, who are you? Oh, you're Sergio's kid. So I kind of can picture you there, right? So going back to this party theme, is that for me, when I look at this kind of structure, is that at a party, when you're with people you love, you're with your family, there's a cacophony of voices, right? You hear all these different voices, and and it all sounds like one. And it is, because it's one family and we're all together, right? And whether that be your blood family, whether that's found family, it's the same thing. And the other part of that, though, is if you know these people well enough, you're going to be able to tune into those individual voices. And if I'm at, Christmas, Las Posadas with my family, Christmas Eve, I can hear my Uncle Ralph laughing. I can hear my tia Mari telling a joke. I can hear one of my cousins sneezing, and I know their sneeze. And so with that in mind is this concept of, even though, like, when you're talking about a multi-generational novel, you're telling one story of a family, and the family kind of takes on its own character. But by the same token, the structure of my book, and I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but the structure of my book is I wanted to give that individual voice. So you hear the cacophony, right? But at the same time, you're hearing individual voices, and they're all telling their own chisme. We have this word in Spanish called chisme, and Kimberly's smiling because she knows exactly what I'm talking about. Gossip, someone will tell a story, and then another person has a different point of view. And so you can only do that in such a way if you're honoring those individual voices, number one, but you're also respecting the corporate or the multiple perspective of this kind of novel.
Thank you. I love what you're saying about how, it is a lot of voices, but the family is also its whole, its own character. And I think that really shows in your work. Kimberly.
Yeah, it's hard to beat the descriptions that both Justin and Rubén have talked about. I think my approach to a multi-generational novel is a bit of both. It's, for me, when I think about telling multiple generations and let's say that's confined to one family, there's something about the idea that each person is afforded their own story. Like, we're living our own life, and you think that I'm the main, you've got main character energy, and you're just moving through your life thinking like it's me and everything's moving around me. And if you stop and look at, the history of your people or of your family, or who came before you and who came before them, you think of the fact that you're just one story in an ongoing story, right? Or that there are stories that are currently ongoing if you are surrounded by family who's still living. But even the family members who've gone away, even those who've passed on or moved off. And similar to what Justin was saying about, like, the gaps, what happens when you have people who can't answer the questions about, like, where we're from, or who we are, or what my life was like. So I think there's something really, really beautiful and almost subversive in multi-generational novels about telling all of the stories, or telling multiple ones, right? So for example, like in my book, it's offered in the first chapter, it's not a spoiler, but Carly's mother leaves her. So Carly's mother is an immigrant from the Philippines, and she returns back to the Philippines and leaves her daughter in America to be raised by her mother-in-law. And Carly doesn't hear from her again. And so ostensibly, Carly doesn't know the rest of her mother's story, and she never will. But the reader gets it. The reader gets a chapter where they get to see what happened to her mother and what she went off to do. And I think that there's something really cool about that, getting that for the reader, if not for the characters in the book. So I just love the notion of, like, all of these stories that are existing, kind of like Rubén saying, like this cacophony of stories, and a book that gives you the chance to see snippets of all of them, right? To see excerpts of all of them, and to have the ability to string them into a larger narrative, a larger story, that maybe even the characters don't get to know that they're part of. So I really enjoy that when I read multi-generational novels. Like, I love being able to pick them, put them together and pick them apart.
Absolutely. And I think, there is definitely something subversive about it, like you were saying. And so I want to talk about the actual writing process now, because in all of these, different threads and voices that you're making room for on the page, I mean, I can imagine that it's a lot to grapple with as a writer. You know, there's so much to consider when you're setting out to write a family saga. And so I'd love to hear about your pre-writing process, and also just like how these books began for you. Did you make an outline? Did you make family trees? Did you do different character studies? Like, how did you, you know, go through all of that process? And Rubén, I'll come to you because I know there's a family tree at the very beginning of your book. So I'd love to hear about when that came into play.
I'm laughing because you said outline, outline. No, there was no outline for me. So my process probably different from a lot of people, but in I want to say 97 or 98, I wrote the first Izquierdo story, and so that's like 25 years ago. And if you've read the book, it's the first chapter, Turroco, and it's about they actually find the curse, and or one of the curses, one of the many curses, right? So they find a curse. I got that published in Hayden's Ferry Review, literary journal, and I tried to write other stories, and I would send stuff out, but nothing was successful. And then I think the next story I wrote was about the same family, of course, but I think it was about Victoria and Gonzalo. So I kind of stayed with this couple for a few stories, and then I got that published in Image journal, and then I sent a couple of stories with Maggie, and even though it's not explicitly stated, but I always kind of thought of Maggie, one of my characters, as a sibling. And so what ended up happening was that over a span of 25 years, I would write a short story about this family every couple of years, and I would get one published, and some of them didn't get published. But by I guess the 13th or so story, I'm like, wait a second, and I'm dumb, right? So it took me a while, and I'm like, okay, I have something here. This is a collection. Maybe it's a collection. Maybe it's a novel. I don't know what this is. And so I put it together and I sent it out a few times. And I know there's a lot of writers in the group, so I just want to encourage you, is that it got rejected multiple times. And by publishers that, you know, small publishers, you know, I'll just say it, Latino themed publishers that I thought would pick up the book. They didn't want it. I don't think they understood it per se. I don't know why, but it did. I know why, because the timing wasn't right. And then the process of stitching it all together, I understand, and I said it earlier, is that I have this longer story, but I have these individual voices telling their own stories that need to be told that are contributing to this. And so in that concept of writing it over so many years, I really got to know this family well. And so how I ended up structuring it as a novel was, if you've read the book, there are these little flashbacks to the past that deal with the first generation, with Papa Tavo, who's the grandfather, and Valentina Izquierdo, the grandmother. And so those stitch the narrative together, because what they do is they're intertextual in such a way that an object that appears in the past also appears in a present story and is a major plot element. Like for instance, you know, a butterfly knife purchased in Reynosa ends up being like a major plot device in another chapter. So I'll keep it short now, but basically my process was discovery. It was writing story after story after story and seeing that I had a larger story to tell, and then deciding how am I going to put that all together. So arranging it in such a way that they happen chronologically, with these little chapters that are interspersed talking about the past. So that was my process. I didn't sit down at one point like a lot of authors do. Like I'm writing a novel right now where I sit down, I'm like, I am writing a novel. No, for me it was, I'm writing a story, and whether that's a collection, whether that was a novel, I never had it defined until like Norton got involved, and they're like, hey, you actually have a novel here. This, I mean, I know we can do collection, but you're telling a bigger story. So that's when I kind of like, okay, so let's start conceptualizing it that way. So that's kind of how that worked out.
Thank you. And I love what you were saying about your process as discovery. I think that's so awesome. And Kimberly, I was kind of hearing some similarities in Rubén's process, because I think your book also started as a short story or short stories. Do you want to talk about your pre-writing?
Yeah, Rubén, I'm going to steal the discovery thing, just so you know. I'm just going to pretend classes start on Monday, and I'm just going to pretend that I invented that so that my students can think I'm brilliant on day one. But no, I think it was pretty similar. And I know Rubén and I have talked about this. For me, it was stories for me almost always start with place. And I wrote the very first chapter of what ends up being one of the chapters of this book. Not long after I had visited Galveston after Hurricane Ike had hit. So my family was living in Galveston and I had gone back to visit. And so this was months later. I think it was, I want to say it was over Christmas break. So either December or January of 08 or 09. And I had the image of like this island that I was born in and that I really loved and that my grandparents lived in and that I was very fond of. Like looking the way that it did. I had that sort of seared into my brain. There's a moment in the book where I talk about driving down Broadway and my uncle, in real life, it was my uncle pointing out the trees that had died because they'd been choked by the salt water, and so like looking up and seeing the brown leaves, pointing out that these beautiful trees that lined the street were all dead. And there was a boat washed up on Broadway, which I will never forget, that they hadn't like parsed through everything. There was a lot of destruction still. And I just had that on the brain. And so like even months later, I think I went back to school the following year and I sat down to write a story because I was on deadline and that's the only time I ever write apparently. And I had nowhere to start but place. And I knew it was going to be in Galveston after Ike. And I found, as I was writing, I found Carly, and then I found her grandmother pretty quickly after that. And then I found her boyfriend, Jess, after that. And I wrote that first story and thought I was done. And then when I came back later, a couple of years later to write another story, I started with place again and I was in Carly's living room, so I had another story about Carly. And then later I wrote a story about someone who I realized was her boyfriend was Jess. And then there were a few places where I think I resisted what I was doing. And I would be like, all right, I'm done with Galveston. I'm going to write about Uvalde now. And even then I'd write a story about Uvalde and realize like, crap, this is a character that's in one of the Carly stories. So I think in my mind, they were always sort of in the same universe. Like, it's very Marvel that way, that you would see characters crop up in each other's places, or they'd, go down the street and they'd go into the store that was owned by someone else. And so in my mind, they were always connected. But I didn't know that that could be a novel, if that makes sense. Like I'd read interconnected short story collections, I'd read novels and stories, and there was something about, the line that I didn't quite know where it was. And honestly didn't feel like I had permission to call it a novel, if that makes sense. The Garza fictional universe, I'm just going to claim it. But so at a certain point, I just needed enough people to tell me that I could do it. And I feel very, very, grateful that I had my agent and my editor behind me kind of saying, you can tell a novel like this, who says that a novel has to be one kind of linear chapter 2, chapter 3 storyline, and why not tell it in this chorus of voices? So, we did a lot of work after that, like to kind of tie them closer together and to look at the narrative, and we rearranged things so that it was a bit more chronological and it had the hurricane at its kind of climax. But it felt much more like a one long story that I always envisioned that was told in many voices, different pieces told in many voices by the end.
Thank you. And, I think it's a great reminder for writers to, your dedication is to the story that you're telling and not necessarily to what you think, a novel should be or what other people are saying a novel is. So thank you for that. Justin.
Yeah, the early writing process on my book, it was, I would say it started with kind of like, psychic whispers. Like I went back to moments that I never let go of from my past, but didn't understand why. So like we never talked about Vietnam in my house. Like it was without ever saying it, like, don't mention that around your father kind of a topic. So that sits with a kid, And then like I remember once there was a moment where my grandmother shushed my great aunt in public because she was speaking Spanish, and like they gossiped all the time at home in Spanish, but like never taught their kids Spanish, and my grandmother did not like it outside the house. I remember a moment where my mom, just out of the blue, she was on one of those like long, corded phones that were in the wall back in the day. And I remember she got really irritated at someone, like a customer service rep from a credit card. And she just mentioned that she couldn't have one herself, because I guess at that time, like women were not being issued cards, individually. And so I was like, why are these like memories that seem kind of like flotsam just going through your head? Like, why did you never let go of them? And then I started to think about, okay, what happened that day? I started that imaginative exercise about people that I knew. And I asked, like, what was happening that day? What would lead someone to have that kind of a blow up? What are the dynamics behind that and why? And so similar to Kimberly and Rubén, like I didn't have an overarching narrative or arc in mind. I just thought, like, won't it be interesting and won't you be better off if you understand a little better stuff that's sat in your psychic junk drawer for decades, like, what is it? And then from there, as I began to write out those moments as individual moments in time, I really wanted to, particularly because some of them involve Vietnam, and I had a real fear of writing about war, and particularly that war, for reasons of representation, for reasons about so much suffering that happened, for reasons about like who I grew up with. And did a lot of work around that. And one of the challenges I find about historical research is like when to let go, when to be informed, but let go. And so, and similarly, I asked myself a question like, what was it like in the days when UT's dorms were desegregating, actively desegregating? What were those years like for someone? We don't really, we kind of think about these historical facts as like events, and they came and they went, and like, in fact, they were lives that were very messy and complicated for a long time. And so did some historical research, and then slowly, very similar to what Kimberly and Rubén said, started to grasp that there might be something that, if rearranged chronologically, like would resemble a novel. And it was actually my agent. It was late for me as well. My agent was like, yeah, I think it's a novel. I think you should call it that. And I think you should put it into this different order now, because, one of the first things I wrote in it was actually a bet at lunch with a friend who's also a writer, like a prolific writer. And we said to each other, let's make a deal. Let's write a story that we're kind of scared to write, because if we force each other to do it, then we'll actually do it. So we did this, and we met regularly. And then he ended up years later doing it, but I did it pretty quick. And it ultimately ended up being a flashback read aloud from someone's journal late in the book, though I thought it was the beginning of the story. And so that's how little sometimes as you're just trying to open yourself to the possibilities that's inside your head,
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting to hear you all talk about your processes and how these books started. And something that we've been definitely talking about and circling is that at the heart of these stories are these characters, these families, these people, whether they were coming from questions you yourself had and you're trying to grapple with those, or just thinking about the people who inhabit a place. I'd love to hear more about how you actually accomplished creating these characters on the page, and how you balanced, making sure that they're unique and their own characters and their own people, while also making sure that they sort of fit into that family structure, or maybe don't fit into it in interesting ways. And so, Rubén, I will come back to you.
Thank you, Sam. That's a tough question. You gave it to me first. I'll answer it. So for me, it comes down to voice. And you'll read some very famous authors, and I'm going to throw somebody under the bus. He's not with us anymore, but I'll throw Raymond Carver under the bus. You read a Raymond Carver story, and every narrator sounds like Raymond Carver. Am I wrong, Kimberly Garza? You're a professor. You know these things. It's all Carver. They all sound the same. And so my rule as an author is that no, and it's a tough rule to follow. I find myself trapping myself sometimes, but my rule as an author is that no two narrators can sound exactly alike. And so, as I'm thinking about like character, to me, character and voice, and I don't have an MFA, so I'm just kind of self-taught, but to me, no two character and voice go hand in hand. You can't separate the two, particularly, I mean, even with third person, you can't separate the two. First person, certainly. And so when you read my book, I have I do third person a lot, but I also do a lot of first persons or whatever, and they don't sound alike. And hopefully they don't. And I get that a lot, is that your narrators sound very unique. And so with that in mind, the way I approach story, the way I approach this type of narration is that, going back to voice again, is that when you have characters and you have a story to tell, you have to, so my approach is to listen to people, right? So that's one of the things I try very hard to do when I'm talking to people, when I'm at the store. So that whole process begins even before you sit down to the computer. So I always encourage writers to listen to people. And right now, like I'm kind of going off topic, but right now I'm a reader for a small press. And one of the things I see in some of these manuscripts is that there's almost a similarity in between writers. And I think, and I think MFA programs are great. I think they're wonderful and a lot of good things come out of them. But I think there is some freedom in not being a part of that, because you can get this kind of hive mind type of narration. And once in a while, a voice will come along, a writer will come along where they're totally departed from that. And then we wonder why. Well, a lot of times they listen to other people. They get that. I think of Jonathan Scoffrey, his book, is getting all kinds of accolades right now, but he has a very unique voice. And I think if I had to, I've talked to him a few times, but I think if I had to talk to him and say it's because he listens to other people, and you have to have that ear as an author to be able to put that down and then to differentiate between your different narrators.
Thank you, Rubén. Justin.
Yeah, I remember doing some get to know you exercises for the characters. They definitely did some like letter to myself type stuff. And for me, it helped me, sort of hone or boil down the most basic questions about what does this person really want? What's the drive? What's the strongest drive in this person? And and I think that without knowing, referring back to what we talked about before, without knowing the overall arc, getting to know these people, it helped with that. And then it also helped with me figuring out how I loved them, the characters, because that was something that was, especially, I think if you're going to explore the people who harm each other most, write a multi-generational novel. So if you're going to get that close, if you're going to go that deep, and you're going to figure out how people harm and repair each other in the most intimate ways that we can, you're going to have to figure out how to love them after they do the bad stuff too, to each other. And so I think that thinking about the last chapter in Kimberly's book, for example, as a good, as like that resonated with me as the kind of way I would want to come to understand somebody who seems incongruous or incomprehensible in their choices. But then you can see how that's your job and that's your privilege when you're writing something.
Thank you so much. I think that's wonderful advice, figuring out how to love your characters, even when they're doing or complicated characters. Kimberly.
Thank you, Justin. That's so kind. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that there's such a challenge because, of course, all of these characters, if you're reading a book written by one author, it can have 400 characters and it will still be the same author, right? So there's this really like clearly defined challenge of how do we change up our innate voice, our own voice, our own writing style, our inflections and our tics and what have you, to give each of these people like an authentic chance at, like, seeming real, and sounding different, and not just like 25 versions of Kim Garza. And I mean, for me, it's a lot like what Rubén and Justin are both saying. Like you want to listen for voice. And like Justin was saying too, I think a lot about, but characters, it sounds very actory to say like characters' motivations, but I mean, it's true. Like, I do think about that. The kind of timeless question is like, what does your character want? What is the desire there that's fueling them, or what is the drive? Which I do consider, because some of my characters have, I kind of have very clearly defined goals like and desires, and some of them are, it's as simple as like, I want to get the hell out of here, or I want this XYZ job, or I want to stay here and have everybody I love stay here with me. And some of them are a little trickier. So I do also try to think about characters, where they're coming from or where they are during the story and where they want to be. And, that's sort of similar, but it's first, I don't know, something about asking that question in that way helped me with a few of my characters, who didn't have like clearly defined desires and were just sort of like moving through their life like, okay. And so I kept thinking about that when I would write, every single person. And as far as voice goes, like sometimes the voice came really easily and sometimes it was a real challenge. So I think I just sort of faked it until I made it, hopefully, with some of them. But a lot of times it's sort of what Rubén was saying, like I drew from voices that I knew or that I had heard over and over. And that often gives me a really good place to start. That's true for character traits too, but that just gives me a place to begin. If I'm channeling, and I'll give one example, which is the one of the chapters in my book that's set during Hurricane Ike's landfall is from or is about the point of view of an elderly man who lives by Carly and Magdalena, whose name is also Ike. So he is like hunkering down during the storm, feeling this kind of deep connection to it because they share a name. And when I thought about Ike and writing Ike, I started with my grandfather. So they have very similar life stories, but not the way that Ike approaches his marriage, which is a little a little scandalous, and my grandfather did not do that as far as I know. But so I really try to draw from places to begin, whether it's a voice or the way characters, if they use multiple languages or dialects, the way they use those, and also just the things that they're thinking about, the things that they're like pushing themselves towards.
Thank you. And so I think in talking about families, we often are talking about, where certain characters have come from. There are people who are looking back to those places, and we're thinking about home. And that often leads us to thinking about place and the cities where these characters are, where families are connected. And I think home and place were very common themes and important themes in all of your books. And so I'd love to hear how you thought about, family ties and the way place and home came into play there for each of you. And Kimberly, I'll start with you because you said earlier, there was no other place for you to start except for place, like Fish Village is such an important part of your book. So
Yeah, it's so complicated, I think, in life in general, but I was really thinking about the strangeness of place and home when I was writing this. And this is something the characters think about too. My father's from the Rio Grande Valley, since it wasn't the Rio Grande Valley, right? Like since it was Mexico or what have you. So something like approaching roots with my dad and his family, it's very different from the way that my mother approached roots as an immigrant from the Philippines. So I would think about that a lot as somebody who grew up in Texas, like firmly rooted in Texas, and navigating these different cultures, but also like when you think about where I'm from, it was very easy to answer. And I saw my mother kind of grapple with that question, like people would say, well, where are you from? Right. Like the kind of that phase. And so I really think about home and place. And I think my characters don't all approach it differently, which was partly me just getting out my different ideas about what that means. Like on any given day, I can feel really great about that question. And on any given day, I can be really ticked off. So I think that for characters like the immigrants or the migrants in my book, everybody approaches it differently, right? Like you've got a character who wants to be in Galveston and wants to make it there and wants to make it their own. And then you've got characters who get there and are immediately like, I can't be here. I want to go where I feel like I belong. I don't think I belong here. And so where do we belong, right? So I feel very fortunate, at least personally, to have good roots, but that doesn't mean that they're not complicated, right? That they can't have complexities, and that this notion of like home and place and being rooted to a place isn't like, troublesome sometimes. And I think that just will continue to give me good stuff to write about. So I will always reach for, I will always start with place and like some really vivid scene or setting that's in my mind, but then immediately we'll go to people. Who are the people there and what's their deal? And a lot of times it comes from like, who are people who are from there and people who found themselves there. And so I kept coming back to that when I thought about Galveston and Fish Village and, Texas really at large. So it's like a complicated question that I don't think the book ever settles on one answer, but instead kind of offers all of these different views.
Absolutely. Thank you. Rubén.
When I think about place, for me, we arrive at the universal by describing the specific. And when I read really good literature, it's literature that I can smell the street. I know what is in the store. I know what they're cooking. I've never eaten it before, but they've named it for me. They've described it for me. And so for me, place is, and like I mentioned earlier with voice and character and these things being, tightly woven together, place is also one of those things. And so I think, when you read something that's, maybe you can't name why it's unsuccessful, but you're not feeling rooted in a place. And so when I sit down to the page, and I bring you into the family, I want you to smell the fajitas. I want you to see the rice and the beans in the pot. I want you to see that little skin of like whatever that weird skin is on the Mexican hot chocolate big pot, it's just floating there. I don't know how that skin forms, but I want you to see that because that's a part of the place, right? So I think the fear for a lot of authors is that, like, if I make this too specific, I'm going to turn people away because it's not going to be their experience. It's not going to be universal. But I don't agree with that one bit, because I can read, I can read Interpreter of Maladies by Jupa Lahiri. I'm not familiar. I've never been to India. I have no roots, no connections to being Indian American. But yet when she writes her place, and even if it's in the Northeast or she's going back to the homeland, the specificity for me grounds me in that place. And so for any writer, I think don't be afraid of writing your place wherever that might be, Central, West, East, Northern Texas, or the Rio Grande Valley, where no one even knows where that's at, because you say South Texas and everybody says San Antonio, and I'm like, hello, like there's even more farther south past the checkpoint where the best food is, but that's just me. So that's the thing is that if you want to really add flavor, add good stuff to your writing, you got to think about the place you're writing from, wherever that might be, because we want to see that. As a reader, I want to see that. I want to, because what is reading? When we get down to it, it transports us, right? We can watch a movie, but we want to be transported through someone else's eyes, through the words that are on the page.
Thank you. Justin?
Yeah, as I was thinking about place in my book, I was thinking of writing from a place of longing because I don't live in Texas now. And when I go back, I went back in the fall to do an event with some libraries on the Gulf Coast. And I was meeting up with a friend who wasn't from Houston. And I said, oh, meet me at the House of Pies over here by Kirby. And I seriously got lost trying to find this place. I hung out so much when I was young, when I was in high school growing up, because so many high rises had gone up around it. I was just like, okay, don't think too hard about it, So when I think about this place, it's with longing. It's a kind of reckoning, because I reckon with the reasons that I left, the reasons why I chose not to build my life where I grew up. And as I explored some of those, I definitely wanted to convey, I love the specificity that Rubén and Kimberly have spoken of, because I certainly know the enriching experience of reading stuff like that. I also wanted to convey, when I was thinking of place, the social environment, the social constraints that are an essential part of any place, because that whole dilemma of the comfort or staying and going has to do with the norms that you're operating within. And so for me, a huge part of growing up in the Houston area in the 90s was evangelical Christianity. And it was the intensity of the kind of social monitoring that accompanied a very sort of evangelical community, or communities that I grew up in and around. And as a queer person, thinking about, how do you develop an integrated, not warped sense of self amid a place with norms like that? Was really a question I was asking as a gender nonconforming closeted gay boy in the 90s in Houston. And yet at the same time, as I thought about the place that I grew up, I was also kind of fascinated by this no zoning, tear it down approach in Houston, which at the time and to this day, to a degree, instills in me a sense of anxiety about history roots, their physical manifestation. Where is it in this city? Why can't I find House of Pies where I told my friend to come meet me from out of town? But with that, I think also as a queer identified person, it resonated with me with the spirit of reinvention that you have to be that kind of outsider. You know what I mean? If you're going to continue living and say that you deserve to, and that you want to create and speak out into the world, then how are you going to do that except salvaging all the parts of you that you thought were broken down by those restrictive norms, reconstituting yourself in the form of another high-rise that's going up in Houston? And so it was something about that I wanted to convey in terms of the place where I grew up. I find it fascinating. I find it scary. I find the Houston skyline and development just this like completely vexing kind of feeling of indigestion and wonder at the same time. And then also kind of recognizing that I'm a product of that.
Thank you. So there are writers watching this who are about to take on, or are in the process of taking on, writing their own multi-generational novels. So I'd love to ask each of you to maybe talk about some of the challenges you face in writing your novels, and what's some advice you would give to a writer who is about to embark on this process, who is in this process. And Kimberly, I'll come back to you.
There's so many ways that there's so many things that I struggled with in writing this, and that I know, my colleagues did, and everyone in the chat who's writing something like this is probably struggling with. I would say probably one of my big ones was because I didn't approach this as like, what's the one story? What's the central story that I'm telling? I was approaching it from, who are all these people? How are they connected? And what does each one of them want to say about this big event? This hurricane that's about to hit Galveston. And I think at a certain point, it was probably really late in the process, like third or fourth round of editing. And I looked and I was like, do I have a story? Is there a storyline in this? Did I forget the plot? Like, does it have a plot? And I think it was really ingrained in me, this idea of like one central arc, right? Like what is the arc that's happening? And I thought, well, there's like 12 people here. I don't know what one arc is for all of them. And I really grappled with that. And I'm sure I wrote like frantic emails to my editor going like, what am I doing? And, you know, cried a little bit, but then I really kind of sat with the story and read it and did some tweaks. And there were gaps in the story that like I filled with some of the other characters or their viewpoints that did help. But I mean, really, I didn't have to do much because the story was there. I think I worried about, you know, the lack of like a traditional sort of plot and, you know, the moment where all of them come together at the end and then they like, you know, I don't know, fight or sing or whatever. And the book doesn't have that. But it doesn't need one. I think that for me, the novel ends up being a narrative about this community, about this place, the people who are there through the storm, who stay there afterwards, and the ones who don't, you know, the ones who've left but are still part of the story of the place. And you know, the story of a place or the story of a family, like we've talked about this you know, all evening, but like the story can be ongoing. It doesn't have to be over. It can just be one part that you're telling, and you know, you can sort of leave the reader with this understanding that this is just one section of it. It will keep moving forward. It doesn't need a conclusion. It doesn't need a resolution. And I could sort of end it with that. So I think once I let each character have their moment and have their moment of change or their acceptance or whatever it was that brought them kind of some sort of closure at the end, I let the story be done. So I think that was the biggest thing, was to really grapple with like my own perception of what a book should have, because I didn't think it had it. But it, you know, you can, I think at a certain point you could trust yourself and you could trust the people that care about your book the way that you do, if they're telling you that the story is there.
Thank you, Kim. Rubén.
Yeah, to kind of sort of piggyback on Kim, Kimberly, I think you have to have something to unify the whole thing. You know, Kimberly, she focuses on place. Mine is a curse, right? And I'm thinking of a book, and I wouldn't call it multi-generational per se, but I'm thinking of Tommy Orange's They're There. And so the unifying thing, there's a lot of different characters, and some of it's multi-generational because there are some relatives, but the unifying thing there is that they're all going to the powwow at the end of the story, at the end of the book. And so that, to me, if you're going to write a generational novel, which was what grounded me, mine was, there's a curse in the family. It affects, you know, 3 generations of the family, even a 4th that's at the very end of the book. But there has to be something to unify, and you know, and Kimberly also mentions you know, the hurricane. That to me, every time you brought that back, it was masterfully done, because like, how do they all react to that event? And so whether that be an event, whether that be a family secret, something has to ground you for it to not meander and just be this sprawling tale. And even successful books, so, you know, books that have done well, like if you read The Godfather, which is definitely one of the great multi-generational books, it kind of meanders a little bit. There's nothing really grounding the book other than it's telling the story of this American family, and it's a great book. I love it. But by the same token, it doesn't have that hook to where you're keeping to come back to it.
Justin.
You know, I think that in the simplest terms, I think the challenge that we face with the multi-generational novel or any novel is that nobody wants it. I mean, nobody wants it until they do. Nobody's asking for you to write it. You know, it's like, what kind of endurance does it take for you to say, I'm going to commit to creating something that nobody wants and nobody's asked for until suddenly everybody wants it? You know, so how do you will yourself forward with those being the realities? And for me, it was does the exercise of writing, are you learning about yourself along the way? Are you gaining an understanding of people? They could be people you know. They could be people you made up entirely. But if you're learning about how people work and gaining an understanding of yourself and of them, then no creative effort is wasted because it's the reward itself. At least that's my experience of the writing that feels the best to me as I'm doing it. And lately, what that's been like is there was a chapter in Rubén's book. I think it was a chapter called Host, where the character Victoria is contending with her different selves at different times, a postpartum self, I think, and then like other selves. And I thought that it's cool that the multi-generational novel really brings into sharp relief how the past and present are always coexisting within a character, within a room, etc. And what it did was it called out to me an important feature of the writing that I'm doing right now, which is just the bearing witness to a life. And so I'm working now on something that has to do with someone who died a long time ago that I met when I was young. And I just, I'm at a point in life where my memory is kind of, like I'm at that age where you start to forget people you cared about. And so I said, there was something lately that I just, I thought as an author, you have the privilege and opportunity to bear witness to a life. And with that comes this opportunity and responsibility to understand somebody else. So I guess the advice that I would give is to try to stay focused on who are the people you're trying to understand as you engage in this process.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bearing witness to a life. I think that's wonderful. So we are going to head into the Q&A now. We already have a few questions lined up. And so to everyone here, please send any lingering questions you have to the Q&A box, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. But to kick us off, here's the first question. I'm in the process of wrangling my 92,000 word family saga into a query letter of 300 to 400 words. Any advice about how to handle that? And Kim, I'll start with you.
Oh man, that's the hard part, right? For anyone. And my book wasn't that long, but it was still hard to shorten it. There's so many good examples of query letters out there that I learned by reading a lot. I had some friends send me theirs. I just read random ones that I Googled. But ultimately, you think about, you're not trying to summarize the entirety of the book. You're trying to create some interest, or at least that's how I approached it. I try to touch on what the book at its core is about, and a couple of good details to make it stand out, to rather than like Rubén was saying earlier, you don't try to go universal or vague, you try to be really specific. So offered some of those, but then, you don't summarize the ending. I didn't summarize how it ends or, the trajectory of the book. I sort of asked questions of it. What will Carly choose? How will Fish Village survive after Hurricane Ike, or will it? And for more, read on, so for more, represent my book. Yeah, that's sort of how I approached it. So it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of editing, and then editing that again, and then editing that again. But I found something that worked for me in just kind of keeping to that formula.
Thank you. Rubén, Justin, anything to add? No? Cool.
No, nothing I can think of.
Thank you.
I guess I would just say, it takes so many words to say something briefly. It takes just so much work and to pare it down. But I mean, for me, I totally agree with Kimberly that leaving the reader with a question about the work forces you to ask the question, what's the question of my work? What is really the question that I'm trying to leave the reader with broadly? And so it can feel so tedious, but sometimes it's just so important to break it down for yourself that way.
Thank you. Next question. Rubén mentioned his story was rejected for publishing because the timing wasn't right. What do you think makes the right timing? Rubén?
Oh, snap. Okay. What makes the timing right? Well, I had to find the right agent. So that was one. And then I had to find the right editor. And that's super vague. I get it. But when I think about the timing, I told you, I got it. I wrote my first story, and I probably had something ready I wrote the first story in 97. I probably had something ready by maybe 2005 or so. Had it been published then, it would be out of print by now. Let's be honest. It'd be out of print. It would have been a small press. I would have been excited. My family would have taken me to dinner probably. But it would have been out of print now. And to me, I'm a firm believer in timing. I think all things, work together for good for those who believe. That's my personal stance. But I think also that there's a person out there that needs to read your book when they're reading your book, if that makes sense. And so I'm going to take the universal global view is that I don't think my book was personally, the person that needed to read it wasn't there yet. They weren't ready to read it yet. So that's my take. The other thing I will say though, just to get kind of grounded in a more pragmatic sense is that the timing of your book, you have to understand that I got my first book published when I was 49. I'm 51 or 48. I'm 51 now. And so I'm a debut author in my 50s. And the thing I want to encourage the younger writers out there is that, there's a myth out there, and I think it's a destructive myth, and I think it's one we need to tear down, is that if you don't publish your first book by the time you're 30, you're a failure. You're an abject failure. And we do that. We make young author synonymous with debut author too often, I think. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're 31 and you haven't published your book, you got time. We're not promised tomorrow, right? But don't think that, hey, if I haven't hit it, I'm not going to be successful, and because that's just a falsehood that I think the timing. A lot of times we think, the clock is ticking. I don't have an agent. I've gotten several rejections. I've submitted multiple times. It's not happening for me. Don't believe that, because I'm on my second win now. Again, I'm 51 and I have a book that's been well received. So I just want to encourage you in that. Keep it up. Don't give up. Don't think that, you have to be on some timeline, because Justin's timeline, Kimberly's timeline, they're on their own timeline. I'm on my own. It's not a competition. It's not a race. It's for you to create good work. Someone is going to connect with, someone is going to find meaning in, and find some goodness.
Thank you so much, Rubén. We've got quite a few questions and not enough time, so I'm going to move on to the next one. My critique group says, I have too many characters. Any advice on how to lure readers in without overwhelming them with this big extended family? Kim?
I imagine this is something that Rubén and Justin probably hear too. I hear that quite a bit about my book that is out in the world, that I can't change now, oh, there's so many characters, there's too many, I got confused, I didn't know who was who. And that's not a critique that bothers me, just because I always knew it was going to be a sprawling cast, and in my mind, that's always what it was. And there were a few that I cut, there were a few voices that on second or third read, weren't saying anything new, or they just didn't quite fit with the rapport that the rest of the book had. So I trusted my gut on those, and I trusted the gut of readers who were reading with me, who said the same thing. And I cut any voices that didn't feel like they were contributing, but I didn't worry about oh, I've got 12 people, how do I make it 5? Because readers can only read 5 characters, and even that might be a lot. There's something about, for many of us, I think it's easy for me to have many voices existing in my space. I have a big family too. And so it's not complicated for me to kind of read a book that has a huge family tree, because I'll pick up on it. And I realize not every reader is like that. But I think that if your book wants that, if your book needs that many voices, and it's clicking and it's hitting and that it's working, that's what it's supposed to be. I there's places where I think you can do yourself the service of wondering, individually, is this person saying something? Is this person really, really adding something to the novel? but I wouldn't worry about like having too many characters because people don't want too many characters. I mean, everything is going to be arbitrary. 2 people will probably be too many for a certain reader. So it's just always going to be like that. So I think, you know, honoring your book and what it wants to be, what it wants to say, what it has to be, is probably the best way to do it.
Thank you. Next question. Plotting is not natural for me, but I'm at 90,000 words and still don't have an ending. I feel like that's way too long for a first novel. Do your endings come naturally? Do you know the ending before you begin, or does it reveal itself during the writing? And I'll throw this one to you, Justin.
So I'm like a recovering type A person. I'm a lawyer by day. I work for the Queens Public Library. It's a wonderful place. But I tell you all of that because I always know the ending when I start a book, and it rarely ends up being the ending. I think maybe some kind of faith that I know where it's going gets me to keep writing. But I think that that's part of the tension I experience when I'm working on it, is like, how do I make myself keep going? Because I feel like there's a story there without closing myself to the little side roads and diversions that may actually be the way to where you're going, but you just don't know it yet. So I don't know about length. I mean, I think, you know, books are all kinds of lengths, but yeah, I've definitely worried about that before.
Thank you. Kimberly, Rubén, anything to add about endings? Rubén?
I'm with Justin, is that I know my ending before I sit down to write. And so my approach, I have to know the ending. I have to know how it ends. And my approach is, how do I get there? How do what do my characters do? What do they think? What do they say to get them to that point? And so, like, yeah, I have to know how it ends first. And like, I can't imagine sitting down. To me, it'd be too daunting to not know how the story ends before I start writing it.
Thank you. Kimberly, anything to add?
I would echo Justin in that I feel like just to get me going, I have to think of an ending, or at least a vague gesture at an ending. Okay, maybe this person lives or dies. I don't know, but it never ends up being the right ending, because the characters grow along the way, I think, or they surprise me. They become different people, and you know, I realize that the ending doesn't, you know, I can't like retcon it into it. But I think if you're already at 90,000 words or however many words and there's no end in sight, you might want to think about, I don't know, some sort of if not the daunting idea of an ending, like a capital E ending, maybe just sort of like a gesture, like a closing beat. You know, what's the sort of beat that I think I can write towards, and that might be the ending. And then see what happens, right? Because you can give, like Rubén is saying, you can give your character something to move towards, but you could also maybe see if that still works, right? If the characters have more to say, then maybe they go past that beat. Maybe that's the climax or something like that, another plot point.
Thank you. So that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you all so much for your insights, and to our audience,